Hey, what's going on, Fire Emblem fans? With this one trick, you can undress any female Fire Emblem unit. Stingray Armada here, back with another banger.
Wait, I shouldn't be trying to get views like this. Video essay mode engage! For a long time now, permadeath has been Fire Emblem's most infamous mechanic, and has felt mostly at home within the series. However, in recent entries, that's begun to change. Intelligent Systems has de-emphasized permadeath with the implementation of turn rewinding, taking the form of Divine Pulse in Three Houses and Milla's turn wheel in Echoes. Many feel that permadeath fundamentally conflicts with newer mechanics in the series, and that its inclusion in recent titles is pointless. Within this paradigm, turn rewinding is often seen as a necessary quality of life feature that protects players from unduly harsh unit deaths. I'm here to say that this could not be further from the truth. Turn rewinding was a mistake, and permadeath absolutely belongs in modern Fire Emblem. But before we can see why permadeath should return to its former glory, we need to understand why it works so well as a mechanic in the first place. Permadeath brings three distinct benefits to Fire Emblem. 1. It encourages and rewards careful play. 2. It gives battles a constant sense of tension. And 3. It creates moments of organic storytelling. The first benefit here is pretty obvious. If the player knows that their mistakes may cost them a unit, they'll most likely play carefully because losing a unit means losing all the rewards gained from the time spent building them up. This discourages the player from using tactics that, while efficient, would never be considered by the game's characters. For example, let's say you're playing a map where the objective is to defeat the boss, and you come across a boss with a pretty high defense stat. If your units can die, then you'll only attack the boss with characters that are capable of surviving his counterattacks. However, if your units are incapable of death and will come back in the next chapter even if they're defeated, then there's no penalty for throwing every unit you have at the boss, because no death is permanent. A tactic like that should be penalized because the in-game characters want to avoid death and injury. The second benefit is tied to the first. When the cost of mistakes is so high, every battle is filled with a constant sense of tension. This is thrilling for the player and called for by the narrative. Fire Emblem games are typically about war or some sort of large conflict. As such, it should feel like death is just around the corner. If the battles didn't feel like this, then there would be an awkward disconnect between the emotions called for by the in-game events and the emotions that the player is actually feeling. The final benefit of permadeath is the greatest, but also the least appreciated, because most players never truly experience it. Permadeath creates what is often called organic storytelling. When a character makes a lucky dodge, narrowly avoiding certain death, you feel it in a very visceral sense. When your prized unit dies, only to be successfully replaced by a unit you never thought you'd use, that becomes part of the unique narrative that is forged by your decisions and mistakes. I get it, dying to a 1% crit sucks, but would any other death be as impactful and unexpected? When resets are not allowed and you're forced to play through mistakes, the drama of the battlefield is truly realized. Every encounter becomes part of your army's history, and the way that you react to disaster and tragedy creates an irreproducible story. The beauty of permadeath is that it rewards excellence without demanding it. In most Fire Emblem games prior to Three Houses, you could beat the game even if you lost the vast majority of your units. If you're a skilled player and can keep most of your units alive, then you'll be rewarded with stronger units in the late game and an opportunity to see more of their story. Novice players are penalized for their mistakes, but well-designed Fire Emblem games always give them the means to avoid soft-locking themselves. Whether it's new recruitable units in the second half of the game, bonus XP, or a limited amount of revives, good Fire Emblem games make permadeath a penalty without making it unfair. Now, before we move on to how turn rewinding ruins the benefits of permadeath, a common misconception about permadeath needs to be addressed. Many players have argued that permadeath, in tandem with the option to reset, presents an interesting tactical choice for the player. The idea is that when a unit dies, the player can either 1. Press on without their fallen unit, saving time and whatever rewards they've gained from progressing through the chapter, or 2. Reset, saving their fallen unit, but at the cost of having to replay the chapter again. Many believe that permadeath's value consists partially in its ability to present the player with this interesting tactical choice. If this is true, then resetting is not just an exploit the player can use to get the result they want, but an actual feature of the game. However, this view has several problems. First of all, resetting was never intended to be part of the game, at least not in the beginning. If resetting was really intended to be part of the game, then why isn't there a prompt that asks the player if they would like to reset each time a unit dies? I think the simplest and most plausible answer is that the prompt isn't there because they didn't intend for you to reset. Additionally, Kaga's own words strongly suggest that he didn't intend for the player to reset. I quote, "It's not a big problem if some of your characters die in Fire Emblem. I want each player to create their own unique story. Don't get caught up trying to get a perfect ending. Have fun." This quote shows that permadeath was intended to create moments of organic storytelling, and that the player is supposed to play through unit deaths. Some of you may want to object that while resetting was not intended to be part of the game, it nevertheless should be. An individual by the name of Choopy Choozy, for example, has argued that permadeath is only viable if it has situational merit. That is, if there are situations in which letting a unit die is at least as beneficial as resetting. Unfortunately, there are some problems with this view. The first problem with encouraging the player to reset is that it asks them to spend their real-life time as a resource. As Professor Boppy has argued, this is not any different, in principle, from asking players to spend some other real-life item as a resource, such as their money. Would anybody say the option to pay a few bucks to revive a unit constitutes an interesting tactical choice? Surely not, but is that any different from asking players to spend their real-life minutes? Either way, the player is asked to weigh a finite real-world resource against the benefits of leaving their units dead. The problem here is not that playing the game takes time, it's that treating resetting as a part of the game's economy encourages the player to make their real-world resources part of their in-game calculations. Besides being eerily reminiscent of mechanics in gacha and mobile games, this also conflicts with the game's narrative. Consider the instance in which a unit dies. Now ask yourself, is this a consequential or inconsequential aspect of the game's narrative? Should the player be thinking about real-world concerns, like how much time they have, when this instance occurs? I think the answers are clearly, yes, this is a consequential aspect of the game's narrative, and no, the player should not be thinking about real-world resources when this happens, because that would cheapen the visceral impact of this important narrative event. What this means is that turn rewinding cannot be defended on the grounds that it's just an extension or streamlined version of the old decision between resetting and letting units die. That decision was not and should not have been encouraged in the first place, because it negates all of the benefits that permadeath brings to the franchise. Now that we see why resetting was never supposed to be a part of Fire Emblem, we can see why turn rewinding needs to be removed immediately. Fire Emblem game design has changed dramatically since the days when Kaga was in charge. While Kaga discouraged resetting, several of the Awakening team members have said that they reset often in their personal playthroughs, and each new entry in the series seems to de-emphasize permadeath more than the last. Milla's turn wheel was the first official endorsement of resetting from Intelligent Systems, and with that came the loss of all the benefits of permadeath. Even though permadeath is still present, it has no effect on the gameplay experience because everyone is aware that no mistake is really permanent. Organic storytelling has been abandoned, as players are expected and encouraged to rewind every time a unit dies. Careful play is not rewarded, as cheap tactics are not penalized. Permadeath was the binding knot between the player's decisions and the game's narrative. Turn rewinding severs that knot, and for that reason, turn rewinding needs to be removed. The benefits of permadeath are too great to let go. I'm well aware that this is a very controversial topic within the Fire Emblem community. I'm sure that many of you have objections to what I've said so far, and so this is the part of the video where I respond to what I think your objections will be. Objection 1. Lower stakes in battle are made up for by the weight of decisions made off the battlefield. This objection comes from Adam with FED. He argues that while Divine Pulse does make battles feel less tense, that's okay because the player is required to make more important decisions off the battlefield. These would be the decisions presented by the social and unit building mechanics in Three Houses. I respond that while the decisions made off the battlefield in Three Houses have weight, they don't elicit the same sense of urgency or dread that battlefield decisions in previous games did. In the monastery, your instruction matters, but the potential cost of instructing wrongly is pretty low. You can always change up your student goals later on, and most characters can be viable in any class. By contrast, if you make a wrong move in an FE game with permadeath, the consequence could be that a unit is lost forever. Choosing what goals your students should have is nowhere near as stressful as making decisions on the battlefield, and it is this high-stakes nature of the battlefield that Divine Pulse removes. Decisions in the monastery just don't cut it.
Objection 2.
Turn rewinding is necessary to attract the casual audience. Old school Fire Emblem was dying, and if we want the series to survive, we need to consider the preferences of an audience that doesn't like permadeath. I completely agree with this. We should accommodate newer and more casual players, not just so the series survives, but so that more people can enjoy the greatness of Fire Emblem. But we already had a solution to this before Divine Pulse and Turn Rewinding. It was called Casual Mode, and it worked just fine. Newer players have a mode that they can play to learn the game's mechanics in a low-stress environment, and seasoned players can play on Classic Mode and enjoy the permadeath experience. Boom, problem solved. We don't need to include a mechanic that totally trivializes permadeath in order to accommodate new players.
Objection 3.
But I misclicked though. I'm honestly kind of baffled by how many people defend turn rewinding on these grounds. It's already so hard to misclick in these games. There's no time pressure on player phase, and you often have to click multiple times before a movement is finalized. If anything, Fire Emblem is the last game that needs a quality of life feature to reverse misclicks. Even if rewinding feels nice when you misclick, that minor benefit pales in comparison to what permadeath brings to the table.
Objection 4.
RNG sucks, no more 1% crit deaths. I get it. Dying to a 1% crit is unexpected and feels punishing. On the other hand, the game does let you plan around this. If you want to, you can only attack with units that would survive an enemy's crit. RNG and the chance that a unit might die to a crit specifically is another mechanic in Fire Emblem that creates tension. It also simulates the unexpected and often tragic nature of deaths during wartime. Death is never planned for, and RNG helps keep the game feeling spontaneous and unpredictable. In my opinion, RNG is another aspect of Fire Emblem that helps create moments of organic storytelling.
Objection 5.
It's optional. Don't like it? Don't use it. Oh boy, you knew this one was coming. This is possibly the most popular defense of turn rewinding, and it's also the worst. A game mechanic is not immune to criticism simply because it's optional. If a game gives me such an abundance of healing items that all combat is trivialized, then the game has made a mistake. Even though I can willfully restrict myself from using those healing items. Using healing items is optional after all. If a game has a side activity or minigame like chess or poker, that minigame is not immune to criticism just because it's not mandatory. But turn rewinding is far more important than a side activity, minigame, or simple resource. It fundamentally changes the player's relationship to their own in-game decisions. Even if a player never uses turn rewinding, the temptation to use it and the fact that it's available is something the player has to live with, whether they like it or not. And on maddening difficulties specifically, Divine Pulse is essentially required to beat the game.
Objection 6.
Permadeath is fundamentally at odds with the new focus on unit building and deep characterization. Considering the amount of time that the game expects you to invest into each unit, it would be unduly punishing to saddle the player with permadeath. When I quoted Shozukaga on permadeath earlier in the video, some of you probably wanted to make this very objection. Permadeath comes from an era of the Fire Emblem series when most characters had a few lines of dialogue at most, and players weren't expected to get very attached to their units. As the series has evolved, its characters have gotten deeper, and players are expected to become emotionally attached to most of the units in their armies. The advent of support conversations and late-game guidance or paralog missions increases the cost of losing a unit. Additionally, the series has stopped giving the player more recruitable units in the second half of the game, and within this framework, permadeath doesn't make much sense. I agree that permadeath is fundamentally at odds with the game design of 3 houses, but I don't think it's at odds with unit building and a roster of deep and memorable characters. The main reason permadeath would be too punishing in 3 houses is that there's nobody to recruit in the second half of the game. Intelligent systems clearly intended for players to use Divine Pulse every time a unit died. If the game had a large number of promotable units that were on par or at least close to your starter units in terms of stats and character depth, then I don't think permadeath would be unduly punishing. In fact, I think it would enhance the story-focused design of 3 houses. Imagine a Fire Emblem game with the lovable characters of 3 houses but with a real threat of death. The strength of these characters alone would give the player a massive incentive to play as carefully as possible, and unit deaths would be some of the most emotional in the series.
Objection 7.
Permadeath never mattered in the first place. For most players, the temptation to reset is so great that even before turn rewinding, permadeath was effectively non-existent. I think this is the most serious objection to permadeath as a mechanic in Fire Emblem. It's undeniable that many players are overwhelmed by the temptation to reset, and that permadeath was non-existent for a large portion of the player base even before Milla's Turn Wheel and Divine Pulse. Even if turn resetting was never supposed to be a part of Fire Emblem, it has ostensibly become a feature of the game because most players simply can't help themselves. I understand that many people can't enjoy these games the way they're meant to be played because the FOMO is palpable and the temptation to reset is always lurking in the back of their minds. In order to remedy this problem, I suggest adding a new mode called True Classic. In True Classic, resetting is literally impossible. In the event that a player unit dies, the game will create an unalterable autosave that writes over any previous save state. If the player shuts off their device or quits to the main menu in an attempt to reload, the game will reload them right after the moment their unit died. I'm not saying that this mode should replace Classic or Casual. It should exist alongside them for those players who feel too tempted to reset to enjoy the game properly. Obviously, the next Fire Emblem game would have to be balanced with this mode in mind in order for it to work. Hell, I would even be okay with giving players Divine Pulse on Casual as long as the game is balanced so that it can be beaten without it, and as long as there is a mode or difficulty setting on which we're not forced to have access to it. Having more options isn't always a good thing. Sometimes restrictions lead to a more fulfilling gameplay experience. I want to be clear in saying that if you don't want to play with permadeath, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with playing on casual mode. If that helps you enjoy the game, I say go for it. My aim is not to gatekeep the series or steer it away from accommodating a more casual player base. Quite the opposite. I just don't think we have to choose between accommodating new players and keeping permadeath relevant. Even if you prefer to play on casual or with resets, I encourage you to give an Iron Man run a try. Permadeath is a special mechanic on the gaming landscape. It is the knot that binds your decisions to the in-game narrative and world. It represents the best that video games have to offer as a medium of interactive storytelling. For that reason, I would be sad to see it leave the Fire Emblem series. Hey, Stingray here. Thank you so much for watching this video. It really means the world to me. Let me know down in the comments what you think of turn rewinding and permadeath as a whole within the Fire Emblem series. If you liked the video, give it a like. If you disliked it, dislike it. And if you want to see more content like this, then hit the subscribe button because I've got more videos like this on the way. Now let's take a moment of silence and remember all those units who died to a 1% crit.